My name's Aaron. It is good to be with you guys. Thanks for coming back. For those of you who came back for round 2, Gluttons for Punishment, mid-afternoon, heady stuff. I appreciate all of that. The beginning of the first one, you guys were kind enough to join me in interceding for a friend. I was wondering if you guys would do this again. Would you join me in interceding that Tennessee beats Duke tonight? How's that going to go? Less of a spirit of unity that I felt before. I don't know what happened there. I'm so glad we did the song. Jason did the song "Behold." I love that song, and we'd sing the song at our church, and I don't know why I just became. I guess I was pretty disappointed that we were the only ones doing it, and then apparently other people are doing this song in other Vineyard churches. It makes me so incredibly happy. I love that song so much. It is rich with hope and expectation. It is a song about the renewal of all things, and I don't want us to lose sight of the bigger picture here, because here we go. You know, I've got a bunch more new words for everybody to learn. I've got 10 more ways in which the world is spiraling out of control, and the time that we're in is bonkers and ridiculous, and it's just a bananas time to be alive. So all of that notwithstanding, the kingdom of God is moving throughout this earth. Our message is one that is fundamentally hopeful and vibrant and alive. Just take a minute, especially if you're starting to feel the weight of some of these things, whether it's now or at points in the past or in the future where you just feel, man, there's so much going on, there's so much swirling, there's so much changing. Just stop, be still, and behold what love can do. It is remarkable what God is able to do and is doing in the world around us. So keep that song kind of with you as we go. Behold what love can do. And then also, I love that song, the lyric that says, "My eyes are open." It gets me every time because I sing with my eyes closed, and I'm usually like the 4th time through that refrain, and I was like, I'm singing really loud about how my eyes are open, and they haven't been open for 1 second the whole time. I realized that once in the 3rd service. So we do 3 morning services, so it's sort of boom, 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 boom. And I was like, I don't think my eyes have been open once while singing "My Eyes Are Open." Speaking of how we do 3 services, it's interesting because we got 3 sessions here, and anybody who's been at our church for a while know that I get a little bit looser and a little bit weirder as we go. So usually I'm pretty much hold it together for the second. Tonight will be a real wild card, like our 11:30 a.m. service is most likely at our church. Hey, I want to take just a second to pray, and then we'll jump back into some more of the cultural shifts and things that are trying to put our finger on some of the trends in our society. And then heads up, I'll do something that is vaguely reminiscent of a sermon tonight. Not now, though. So here we go. Yeah, so King Jesus, Lord, would you just help us in what is, for a lot of folks, sort of the fog of the afternoon, and a lot of ideas and concepts, a lot to sort of process all at once. Lord, I just ask you would help us to keep perspective as we move through this. Help us to hear from you, God. I have no idea if you're going to speak through me or just into our hearts, but Lord, whatever you have for us, we really, really don't want to miss it. So Lord, would you let your kingdom come and your will be done in this room, even as it is in heaven. It's in your name we pray. Amen. There's a guy named Leslie Newbegin. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? It doesn't for most folks. Don't fret it. Oh, there he is. Yeah. Leslie Newbegin, absolutely brilliant mind. Okay. Interesting story. He left as a young man. He left the United Kingdom to do missions work in India. He left in the 30s. And he did not come back even for a visit. He did not come back to the UK until the 1970s. So he was gone for 4 decades. And a lot went down between 1930 and 1970 in the UK. Even if you're not a history buff, you got probably a sense of that. And so he didn't step on the soil for 4 decades. And when he finally came home, he was expecting to find the same place that he had left behind. And he was absolutely wrong about, shocked by how different. The place that he came back to was a totally different place. He left a thoroughly Christian and Christendom environment in the UK, and he comes back to an entirely post-Christian, biblically illiterate place, and he was shocked from it, a place where the people were, on balance, just really far from God. He tells a story that when he returned, he was teaching at a seminary, and he kept referring to the gospel as shorthand, and he had to stop and explain to the people who were attending his seminary class what he meant by the word gospel. So he was stunned. And when he came back, he was like the only one who could really see it. It's the whole frog in the kettle thing, you know. Are you guys familiar with that? You put a frog in cool water, you warm up the water, and it won't even jump out. It'll just sit there and fry. It's not aware of what's going on. So interesting. I mean, he came back in the 1970s to retire. You know, he left as a missionary from the UK, and without knowing it, he was returning as a missionary to the UK. And he did his most significant work when he came back. And he was the guy who sounded the alarm and woke up a bunch of sleeping Christians in the UK, had no idea what was going on. Here's what I'm telling you this. Change has happened so rapidly in the last few years in our context that if we'll stop and take some time to evaluate it, we can all see it. Like, if you were around in 2015, I think you all were, or, you know, about that time, and you're still around now, then you have seen 40 plus years of change. You've seen 4 decades pass by in the last few years. You can, if you, again, you got to stop and take stock, but you can feel the before and the after the way that only Leslie Newbigin could in the UK 50 years ago. And then we have from that perspective, hopefully, the capacity to be a voice of reason and of reasonableness and of hope and of clarity in the midst of a wild context, the way that Leslie Newbigin was. Those are some of the books that he's written. He's written several others. A couple of them are on the list if you looked at the book list earlier. So I think we have the opportunity, just like Leslie Newbigin was, because now we're living in a guy named Mark Sayers, another really helpful author. He says we're living in a gray zone, this idea where we're kind of caught between two realities. I think it's a very important idea. And it's gray because things are neither one thing or the other, neither black nor white. And there's almost unprecedented instability because of all this change. Just mountains are moving and realities are shifting, and the anchors and the foundations and the institutions and all the things that aren't supposed to move are moving, and nobody knows what's going to happen next, and it's incredibly disorienting, and it is pure anxiety, man. It's just pure anxiety. Because when you experience this much disruption and change, it's all the more disorienting about, well, what is going to be next? And all we can do is guess. I want to be very clear. All we can do is guess. And I'm not even sure it's helpful to guess because we don't know. It is, by the way, this is a mistake that I think is commonly made. It is a mistake to assume that things will continue on their current path. You say, well, this trend has been happening for X amount of years, and if we sort of extrapolate that out over the next 40 years, then here's where we're going to end up, and this is the path that we're on. That's a mistake. The established trend of trends is that they change. They shift unexpectedly. So I know if we could sort of say, okay, we take the last 5, 8, 10, 15 years, and we extrapolate that out, that leaves us in a really rough spot. I'm not sure that's helpful. There's a lot of hand wringing and pearl clutching, you know, about kids these days and how it's all going to what's the expression? It's all going to where in the handbasket? Josh, where's it go? No, you know it. It's everything's going to where in a handbasket? I didn't get it. So at lunch, Ethan was telling me that Josh never swears, and so I'm on a new mission. Like, I want it to happen, and I want it to happen when it's being recorded. So I really do. But he doesn't. It's not even in there. Okay, well, you should be talking. You're so much better than me. Anyway. going to hell in a handbasket is the expression. He's never heard it. His ear's so pure. But the real trend, pulling focus, sorry. The real trend is that trends change, okay, and pendulums swing. That's the way this goes. And so some people go, oh no, things are not as good as they used to be, fill in the blank, reasons. And so people, I think, are asking questions akin to this one. Is what we're experiencing now, is this a blizzard? Is this winter? Or is this an ice age? Right? Like what are we really, and the truth is, we don't know. And I don't know, and I don't want you to get any impression that I think I know. I don't know. There's been a lot of talk about the beautiful things that happened in Asbury, at that campus, and so the questions are, is that the first fruits? You know, is it the first drops of this outpouring? Is it, yeah, maybe. Maybe we're on the precipice of a new uprising. Or guys, maybe we're on the leading edge of a new dark ages. I don't know. And you don't know. And if it is a new dark ages, Christ is king, and he is renewing all things. And if it is a new outpouring that we're on the precipice of, well then, really fun that we get to be a part of it. Either way, Christ is king. He did not fall off his throne, and he's continuing to carry about intended. But there has been a dramatic shift, as we know, and the pandemic is a major shift with that as well. You know, I heard it said, I remember that we were set up for a new roaring 20s. If the 1920s were the roaring 20s, right? If y'all remember that? Who remembers? No, you weren't alive. But the roaring 20s, you know, and we were all set up, the stage was set for that to happen. And then instead, all of this has happened. And we're not experiencing, I don't think, the roaring 20s. Instead, I heard someone recently say it's actually the realistic 20s, where the wild rabbit optimism that marked 100 years ago in the United States is now people coming off of that high and realizing we actually have to be anchored in a way and be really solid in who we are, or we're going to get caught up in the swirl of it all. And it's interesting for how that's impacting emerging generations. So they're interesting watching what has happened with the millennials and Gen Z behind them and the shifts that they have experienced. That's a lot of change in one lifetime. I think a few lifetimes worth if you're a millennial. I'm gonna read something that is indicative of a mindset that is not very realistic. This is written by a millennial journalist, and she hasn't accepted the reality of the realistic 20s and still waiting for the roaring 20s to come back again. I wonder if this will resonate at all. I didn't put it in the slides. She wrote this: inflation is rising, and now I live more like a boomer than a millennial. Yes, living costs have become so bad that my lifestyle is more like a semi-retired mom than a hot young person. I'm meant to have the time of my bloody life, not passing on girls' nights so I can afford to get my daily coffee. That's an interesting sentence, isn't it? Because the baseline of expectation is really nice daily coffee. You know what I'm saying? And so anyway, in 2023, being a millennial means Ubers, Uber Eats, brunches, dinners, and same-day orders from the iconic. My boomer parents have constantly rolled their eyes at these antics and ranted and raved about how they never lived as lavishly as I did. Have you guys heard any of this tension happening between the generations? I'd roll my eyes right back and explain that I'm in my Paris Hilton era and must be left alone to make bad choices while I'm young enough that it won't ruin my life. However, inflation is slowly stripping away all the fringe benefits of being a young person. I should be in my Paris Hilton era, able to make questionable life choices. Suddenly, I've been reduced to making cuts and making life less fun. This is written unironically by someone who is sounding the alarm for what we're facing in this day. She goes on, I'm young. I should be buying $20 cocktails, getting Ubers home at 2 a.m. from nightclubs with sticky floors, and ordering Uber Eats the next day to treat my hangover. I shouldn't be telling my friends how enraged I am about the rising cost of blueberries, although I am infuriated. Suddenly I'm at the point where the cost of a night out is becoming so expensive that I have to forego experiences of my youth to keep a roof over my head. And she ends by saying, again, unironically, and that is a national shame. I know. And yet it's so representative of a norm that is at least in pockets, I read something not too long ago that in the previous couple decades, older generations had to rely on millennials to teach them how to live in a digital world, and now millennials and Gen Z, younger ones, now have to turn around and look to the older generation to teach them how to live in the real world, because we've been living in this digital distraction, and suddenly things got so real, that you had to look away from the digital. And I think it's a real sense of panic in emerging generations. And we don't know what's going to happen next. So I picture a rubber band as things get more and more intense, and they get stretched out, and our society becomes more and more polarized, for example. Well, what do rubber bands do when they get stretched out? Well, they do one of two things. They either snap or they retract, one or the other. And we don't, and those are two very different outcomes. We don't know which is coming. But what's inescapable and what is a little unsettling is that all of that pendulum swinging in recent years is uprooting some deeply entrenched social norms. And you can't just swing your way out of the implications of things getting uprooted that are deeply entrenched. Okay, so I said earlier it's a mistake to assume that the trends will persist as they are, but how things have occurred so rapidly has changed so much in the process, and the uprooting of norms is a lot faster process than rebuilding the norms on the other side. Okay, so we're renovating a church building right now. It's a 6-month process. Demo was 2 weeks. It's like no time. And now it's the hard part of building it all back together. And so a lot has been dug up and needs to be restructured in our society. And it may end up being for the good. We may end up in the best spot yet, but it's going to take a while. So I know it's a little bit abstract, but let me tell you what I'm driving at. This is, I think, a pretty important idea. This sort of anthropology 101. This is just how humans work, okay? Humans, we build institutions in order to solve problems and create stability. Let's just give you a second to think about that. We establish institutions in order to solve problems and create stability. It's just what humans do. We've done this across time, across cultures, societies, all throughout history. It's just human nature. We create civic institutions, and that's mostly the work of governments, okay? Because we need the things that governments provide, okay? So we need just to order our society, okay? We need laws to govern us. We need education. We need military. We need infrastructure. We need food security. We need law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. These are all civic institutions, okay? We also need religious institutions. Religious institutions give us a grid for the divine, a grid for the afterlife, a grid for morality. It's a huge part of what it means to be human, Christian or otherwise. And we also need social institutions, and these exist formally and informally, but they give us norms about, well, how am I supposed to behave, and what's expected of me in this context or that context, and how are we supposed to interact with one another. Okay, so we build these institutions, again, to solve problems, to create stability. So stay with me, this is really important, I think. We can think of institutions as structures that societies build in order to help us manage our anxiety. We have a baseline level of anxiety. The world is a scary place. The institutions that we build, again, across time, culture, around the globe, we build institutions to create stability, to solve problems, and ultimately we can think of them as structures that help us bear our anxiety. Y'all got it? Okay. So, if our government and our political processes are all just humming along just beautifully healthy and strong, then what that means is we got a whole bunch of things we don't have to worry about. that things that we've never, as Americans, maybe never even thought to worry about, because it's been carrying our anxieties in a real way. Like, we're secure. There's a way to educate our kids. There's food supply. It's stable. Like, when you go to the grocery store, there's insane amounts of food there. We're protected from outside threats. Like, I mean, it's been a long time, I think, since we were genuinely afraid of outside military threat. The water is clean. The roads are safe. There's a really high probability that the money you have in the bank today will be in the bank tomorrow, okay? Not worth as much as it was today, but so basically, there's a million. If you took any one of those things away, then you would have loads of anxiety right now. If we were suddenly vulnerable to outside military threat, there's been, some banking collapses. If you looked onto your phone and thought, oh no, my bank's on the list now, and my money's no longer secure, then you would just get waves of anxiety right now. So again, this is a cultural institution that is carrying the weight of our anxiety, okay? And they bear the institutions that we naturally build across cultures, they carry the weight of our most basic fears and insecurities. That's our civic institutions. Our religious institutions, same thing, just different sets of fears and anxieties. Like, why am I here? What is this about? Where did all of this come from? Why does any of this matter? Does any of this matter? Can I be forgiven? Am I loved? Can I be accepted? What happens when I die? On and on we could go. These are major questions. And religious institutions give us a framework to help bear some of that weight. Social institutions, again, same thing. How do I behave? What's normal? What's acceptable? How do I make friends? How do I keep friends? What's allowed? What's not allowed? Who are my people? What is a family? What is my family? Who can I have sex with? On and on and on. These are, major fundamental basic human questions and anxieties. Whether we realize it or not, our institutions help us make us stable and secure in the world because we cast our anxieties onto those things. Which is why, whether we realize it or not, we question and we challenge all institutions when things get tough. We do it reflexively, we don't even realize it. When we have this understanding, these things are supposed to keep me from being afraid. And when I become afraid, I start looking at institutions and pointing the finger. Why am I afraid? And you're supposed to be the solution. People do it reflexively without knowing all the time. If we're stressed, we point the finger at institutions that are supposed to help us manage that stress, and fair enough. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I think sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong, okay? It's just always been that way. It just is. But here's the outcome. We get anxious, and our anxieties then lead us to tear down the structures that we have built to help us manage our anxiety. And sometimes that's the right thing to do. Sometimes it isn't. Depends on the circumstances. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It just is. When humans are anxious, we tear down the structures designed to help us manage our anxiety. And so think about it. What does that do? It just creates more what? It just creates more anxiety. And it starts a cycle that very often leads into full-on raging panic. It's a little bit like being afraid that your life raft is losing air, so you just grab your knife and slice it open. That's kind of the human nature. It really is. And in that moment, it's like, well, maybe the life raft was faulty, and maybe it needed to be replaced. And maybe you just put that life raft in its place in that moment. But your anxiety just got worse and not better. And you just became less safe and not more. Get the idea? Okay. So this is how these things speed up and spiral out of control. So we're in a very anxious system right now. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of blame is being shifted onto institutions. It's happening all around us. Just some obvious examples. I'm not sure that I can trust law enforcement, so let's defund the police. That's stabbing your life raft. I'm not sure I can trust the election results, so let's raid the Capitol building. That's stabbing the life raft. Again, I picked one from the left and one from the right just to keep going. Or Or a bit closer to home, I can't trust the integrity of all church leaders, so I'm out on the church entirely and all religious institutions that come with it. And what that does is sets people into a spiral. So social institutions are eroding too. It's just harder to see because social institutions aren't as clearly codified as the others, but it's all around us, right? My family's not reliable, and so family structures are wrong, you know. Some people are intolerant, so I'm going to become radically intolerant in order to combat intolerance. Has anybody noticed that? Like that's a social norm that's been violated, and then a spiral that's been initiated as a result. The ultimate social institution, though, is a family unit, and that, of course, it's been fuzzier than it's ever been, and you know, from all the angles, it's been challenged, and particularly by emerging generations. We all know this. One of the ironies there, though, is that the validity of the family unit is being questioned in deeper and deeper ways by emerging generations, but also emerging generations are failing to launch and won't leave the institution that is their home and household while stabbing said life raft. And it's, I mean, there's irony in that, but I think the reason for that is because, and I don't understand the whole picture, but a piece of it, I think, is because the other stabilizing institutions that you would then go rely on outside of your family aren't trusted either. So I can't go lean on the church, or I can't go lean on, you know, a civic institution that's going to help me, you know, get through this tough phase or whatever. And so they're attacking the home and then staying home at the same time. And again, this is all fueled by panic and fear and growing anxiety. Anyway, enough of that. When this happens on a large scale, like I think it has in our context, advanced societies like ours, we live in a very advanced society, advanced societies start acting more and more primitive, okay? The institutions that we developed in the first place are what helped us to advance, okay? And now they're either gone or they're not trusted. And if you think about the role of an institution is a place that can help me carry my anxiety. Well, it could be working great, but if I don't trust it, it's not serving me at all, okay? So that becomes, again, self-defeating. And so it goes from bad to worse. And then we regress to tribalism, okay? That, I mean, I see this happening everywhere. In the absence of trusted institutions, people create tribes because people need a measure of security and connection. And so when they're sort of things they go to by default to create that security aren't there, then we resort to tribalism. You guys seeing anything like that? Anybody notice any fringe groups popping up? That's the thing. Any of your friends digging in their heels, becoming less and less reasonable, more and more extreme in their perspectives? More and more ethics packaging, which is the idea that if you are one of us, then you not only believe this, but you believe all of these things. And if you believe these 100%, and if not, you're out. Well, I'm afraid, I'm tribalistic now, I don't trust my institutions, I'm going to go 100% into this group that says I have to accept all of the all of the tenets of what they believe. Okay, that's how tribalism gets deeper and deeper and stronger. And so the result of that is when the anxiety is too much, we splinter into warring factions, like the political left and the political right, for example. We step out of community, we embed ourselves into a tribe because we're afraid. And it's happening all around us. Everybody still with me? Okay, let's read some Bible. 2 Timothy chapter 4. For the time will come when the people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. So, people will question established truth. They will reject teachers. They will look for what suits them best. They will find people who will tell them what they want to hear, which has never been easier in our globally connected world than it is now. And I don't even have to ask. I know you can see this happening in our context. I know that you can. And because things are destabilized as they are, this is, going back to what Mark Sayer said, this is like standard gray zone behavior. Okay. Just a quick note on this. I just want to plead with you as the people of God. Do not blame or attack people for doing this. Okay? Flailing people, all right, flailing people, you get scared and you start flailing. They hit everything near them. They create a mess of everything. They hurt everybody who comes close to them. And we need to have the compassion to realize this is happening because they are terrified. They are stuck in a sustained panic. And if I'm gonna have any attempt to love these people, I'm gonna catch some stray blows. It's going to make you mad. It's going to hurt. Okay? I don't know how many times I've had conversations with people who are just crushed because the family reunion they canceled it this year. Can't even do it anymore, and it's over political divisions that have always been there, but now they're all fighting words, and the family can no longer abide. You can't stay under the same roof. Like, it is infuriating how hurtful that is, and I want to encourage you to love your neighbor and to be kind, and don't blame. Have the compassion as you would for anyone in a state of sheer desperation, because that's what's generating it. So don't assume malicious intent. That's not what's going on. They're terrified. That's what's going on. They're trying to find something to hold on to during an earthquake. That's what's happening. They're just going to grab onto anything. This feels stable, right? Okay, but here, the next verse, verse 5. This is the one I want to focus on. But you keep your head in all situations. I love that phrase so much. Keep your head in all situations. You. Keep your head in all situations. I wish I knew all of you by name. I would just go hold your face and say, you keep your head in all situations. This is what Paul writes to Timothy, a leader in the church, as you know. Keep your head. Endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Discharge all the duties of your ministry. Keep your head in all situations. I have been, frankly, profoundly discouraged by the number of Christians who have lost their heads. Keep calm and carry on. Does that ring a bell? It's just another way of saying keep your head in all situations. Of course, people are panicking all around you. That's the way of things. That's what always happens in times like this. People are clinging to their life rafts and stabbing them all at once. But not you. Not you. You keep your head in all situations. You might go, well, how do I do that? Everybody else is panicking. Why wouldn't I panic? Because we're Christians. Because we're Christians. And we still have a place to cast our anxieties when our institutions can't bear them. So everybody else, they got nowhere to go with them. And the King of Glory says, cast your anxieties on me because I care for you. So you keep your head in all situations. At the family reunion that used to be lovely and is now contentious, you be the one. You be the voice of reason who keeps your head in all situations. Keep your head in all situations. At work, when the conversation just spiraled in an instant, like we were talking about the fact that we're out of cream or something, and then all of a sudden people are about to come to blows and you're standing between strangers. You be the one who keeps your head in all situations. When people get to the end of their rope and they've tried every desperate measure, they're going to take a moment, probably at rock bottom, and look around and said, who has kept their head? Who can I go to now? I went to this fringe group and that fringe group. I took these histrionic measures. I was fearful in this way and that way. What's left? And they'll go, that person. They weren't on their high horse. They weren't angry. They weren't spewing vitriol and hate. And most of all, they were calm. And they kept their heads. I can go to them. I can go to them. I have said to our church for the last few years now, while everybody else is losing their heads, let's keep ours. And then people will start coming. About 80% of the last people we've baptized in the last, say, 12 to 18 months are people who came to us just because you were the kind and reasonable people in a county that was going bonkers. Keep your head in all. Have I said that yet? Keep your head in all situations. Keep your head in all. Who wants to get matching tattoos? Keep your head. We get them right around the neck. Keep your head in all situations. Keep your head in all situations. Keep your head in all situations. I'm begging you. Keep your head in all situations. Who's watched Ted Lasso? You can admit it. I know. He hasn't. Oh, it's really funny. You can admit it. It's okay. It's the Father knows best of our time, which shows how far we've fallen. But Ted Lasso says, I think pretty brilliantly. Okay, I heard there was a fan in the room or two. Anybody remember the 2 buttons? He says, there's 2 buttons I never want to hit. Anybody remember? Snooze and panic. It's the 2 buttons he never hits. Snooze and panic. It's actually really solid advice. Snooze and panic. All right. Next session, we're going to talk more about actually how to do that. And I said I'll do something at that point, at least vaguely resembling a sermon. But let's spend more time talking about how everything's chaotic, okay? So when things are destabilized, we attack institution. And that's when things start getting really weird because they're stabbing their life rafts, right? And they start getting desperate for anything at all to hold on to. And in that desperation starts swirl and churn more and more. And when they start spinning, they tend to spin out of control. This is what always happens in a context like ours. It's happened throughout history. And it happens in the wake of a collapsing Christendom. It happened in Europe after World War I. It happened in most of the U.S. after the Social Revolution of the 1960s. And ever since then, and in the Bible Belt, again, my 2 cents, within the course of the last few years, and people have been trying to desperately reconstruct their realities. As we've already said, Christendom brought order in large part because it provided a rational, coherent story of everything and a worldview that actually worked. But when Christendom collapsed and that worldview was rejected, people no longer had that rational anchor to hold on to, even though, by the way, almost a vast majority of people, some overwhelming majority, have no idea that's what's going on. Have no idea that's the source of their panic and why things feel completely out of control, that they have no rational, coherent story to make sense of their world, but it's been kind of an existential hellscape ever since. And new worldviews are kind of jumping in to try to avoid. We talked about a little bit of that earlier. But there are other worldviews that aren't so much making, I don't think, the bid for the throne of American culture, as we discussed before, but trying to capture the minds of Americans and how we should behave. So there's a chart here that will give you a little bit of context. I just want to go through a few of these, kind of one at a time. I see all of these happening to varying degrees. The United States is less and less a monoculture. So rather than it being one thing as opposed to the other, the reality is they've begun to swirl more and more. Okay, it's okay if you can't read it. It's maybe a little small. Yeah. Okay. But I'll go through it. So the first is hedonism, and there's for each of these I want to look at the questions that are raised by, again, people without institutions in place, and then how these answer it. So hedonism is a common one, and if you ask what is the purpose of life, a hedonist says the purpose of life is pleasure. Period. Okay, and this is very common mentality. What is sin then? Well, to a hedonist, sin is anything that restricts or prevents pleasure at all. Right? To a hedonist, well, what is the world? Well, a world is a playground. It is whatever's fun, whatever is physically gratifying, sports, sex, travel, self-expression. You could continue filling in the list. You ask a hedonist what is faith, and they would say faith is sin. It is old, it is regressive, it is repressive, it is too moral, it is a system of control designed to keep you from experiencing real pleasure. And so faith itself is the great sin of this world in the eyes of a hedonist. And so what's the solution? And the solution that they propose is, well, everybody relax. and search your heart, man. You know, like if it feels good, do it. You be you. And the solution that they propose is actually, if everyone will pursue in an unlimited fashion their own pleasure, then it's actually going to solve all of the problems. If we take off all the restraints, then people's repression will no longer be making them behave poorly, and everyone will behave well. Okay? The system has been tried and found wanting, by the way. But that's the mentality. And lots of people go, it's kind of like expressive individualism. That's an easy sell. Do whatever you want. Okay. Moralism. Moralism says, what's the purpose of life? It's to do good deeds. It's an interesting sort of brand of moralism that has really erupted onto the scene in the last few years. A lot of virtue signaling. It's a whole new moral construct that is detached from biblical standards of morality. Even when the biblical standard of morality is clearly the more logical one, it's rejected out of hand, frankly, because it's biblical. And there is now an opposition to biblical morality. Remember, that's the sin, that's the repressive thing. And so they're trying to construct a moralism that doesn't accept really anything from Christian morality. And it doesn't, I mean, that does not work. So it becomes this weirdly inverted moral code. And so what is sin? Oh, sin is the oppression that comes from ignorance. So in the sort of moralistic worldview, education is the answer. Okay, if people only knew, if we can teach people, if we can train people, if we can teach them what they know, if they can have the blinders of, you know, their Christian faith taken off of them once and for all, then they'll be free to know, things like that. And what is the world? The world is a good place ruined by ignorant people. Again, if these people knew better, they would not repress, they would not, and if they just knew how to treat one another well, which is really hard to do when you treat one another well, but you have to reject the morality of Christianity. But that's the idea. They just don't know better. And what is faith? And this is very interesting. Faith is too immoral. It doesn't have a high enough moral standard. And so it's taking things like, you know, a lot of the hot button issues, LGBT, abortion, etc. A lot of these hot button issues, cranking them up to this lofty moral standard and presenting that, and again, that's the virtue signaling that we referenced earlier. And then the solution is education, okay? So moralism is sort of churning right along, and there's a lot of weird inverted things going on in moralism in our context today. Maybe a little bit more on that in a minute. The next is a therapeutic worldview. A therapeutic worldview, we ask, what is the purpose of life? It says it is to feel peace, period. It is to feel peace. This is the ultimate good. So there's no pressure to feel wonderful. just peace. It's just be okay. And so sin then is anything that causes trauma or pain. Anything at all. Even if it's an unfortunate truth. Anything that causes trauma or pain becomes fundamentally evil. The world is a dangerous and traumatic place, okay, that robs us of our peace. Faith, in the eyes of a therapeutic worldview, is acceptable if it's used for peace, exclusively. If it helps you get connected and you calm and you peace and you're okay, that's great. If it challenges, no. If it pushes, no. If you feel a modicum of conviction, no. Okay. But if you get peace, right on. Then have as much faith as you want. And then the solution is ultimately safety from mental and emotional harm. Jonathan Haidt and somebody else wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. Does that ring a bell for anyone? Really insightful book. And it explains this very significant shift that has occurred around the concept of harm. You rewind the clock a little bit, and harm is when someone is physical pain. And now harm is included anything that looks like emotional pain. And now emotional pain, the next is anything that disagrees with me. And so what we're left with is, I believe this to be truth. Well, I believe this to be truth, and because you believe that, you have attacked me. and I'm going to sue you, or I'm going to cancel you, or whatever it may be. And this is a major shift. This is a major worldview shift, and it's really fueled by the sort of therapeutic worldview that says the solution is safety from mental and emotional harm. And then finally, nihilism. Nihilism's dark, man. Nihilism is when we give up on anything being good, okay? So what is the purpose of life? The purpose of life is to feel nothing. Because nothing, you can't expect anything good, so the best you can hope for is nothing. That's the best case scenario. What is sin? And this is, again, it's a very dark worldview. A nihilist would say sin is reality. Sin is the baseline for humanity. What is the world? The world's a disaster. What is faith? Faith is corrupt like everything else and everyone else, because everything is corrupt, because it's all a disaster, because pain is the baseline for reality, and therefore the best you can do is be numb. And then, so what's the solution? It's retreat, it's escape, it's distance. It's numbing, okay? And you can imagine all the places that inevitably leads people. Now, with that in mind, what I want you to see is that these things are fueled by reactivity. These worldviews, none of which are ultimately, again, they're not coherent. They collapse in on themselves. They keep popping up specifically in reaction to one another. And it's happening all around us. And again, it's part of the swirl. And the irrationalities of each becomes more and more obvious, and that it becomes a springboard to the next. So some of the examples that I think highlight the madness of crowds, which is another interesting book, by the way, The Madness of Crowds. Here's what I'm saying. This is so bonkers. Hedonism, all right? You guys remember hedonism? It's up there still, right? Yeah. Hedonism is now fueled by conservatism. If you know those two words, you know that's bonkers. Doesn't make sense. Well, as a baseline, people with conservative sensibilities reject hedonism. And yet, think about who the conservative heroes have been in our context. Kid Rock is a conservative icon. Kid Rock. Kid Rock is a conservative icon. He is as hedonistic as you could possibly want it to be. And yet he has become a bastion of conservatism, and yet he's a raging hedonist. That is an inverted reality. Well, I'm saying it's getting weird. That's what I'm saying. Things are getting weird. Country music in general, I'm trying to figure it out, y'all. And it's important because recently my daughter has gone country, and so I'm trying to, okay, is this okay? How do I feel about this? Country music is like the soundtrack of conservatism. I think it's fair to say, right? Like, it's a law that it has to be played at every right-leaning campaign stop. You have to play conservative music. Fine. Country music. And whatever, I'm from East Tennessee. Bring it on. It's fine. But have you listened to the lyrics of country music and compared it to like 20 years ago? It's a weird thing. It's almost entirely about sex, alcohol, and church. Often in the same verse of the same song. You ever heard of Morgan Wallen? Every verse of every song is like, these are my 3 favorite things: sex, alcohol, Jesus, probably in that order. And he's not being ironic. And it's getting swirled together. And he's like a conservative champion. That's weird. And I don't know, I'm leaving, so I'm gone tomorrow. The elected champion of the conservative party is Donald Trump. Now hear me, I'm not talking about politics. I told you before, I don't understand politics. I don't know what we should do. Maybe he's a right. I don't know. I'm talking about the morality of a human being. And that man, regardless of his politics, again, maybe he's right, he is a celebrated hedonist. He brags about it. He is a thrice married, gaudy, womanizing, grab her by the you-know-what hedonist. And, again, I don't care if you voted for him. Maybe you should have. I don't know. It's not my point. We haven't had great options lately, so be it. My point is just that the world is so upside down that conservatives are choosing to elect unapologetic hedonists. That's weird. And then, in response to that, a highly restrictive, demanding, unforgiving moral code emerges. And where does the moral code come from? Hyperliberalism. Hyperliberalism. That's backwards. That is upside down. That is inside out. It is bonkers. The more liberal you are, the more likely you are to be the self-proclaimed morality police. That was supposed to be the conservatives. But now they're the hedonists. What is happening? It bothers me. Okay, anyway. It is incoherent. Claiming the moral high ground without a well-established moral code becomes massively contradictory. And so the new moralism, which has come from hyperliberalism, lacks any element of forgiveness or mercy or grace, because this constantly changing moral code only has shame to use as a stick to motivate people to stay in line and not love. And of course it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I think it's very interesting what's happened with Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter started literally as an expression. 3 inspiring words put together. And then Black Lives Matter, as it gained cultural influence at a time in which there was no one on the cultural throne of our society, people have then turned to BLM as a moral organization. And this is entirely unfair to the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, because they're saying, okay, we have to respond. People are asking us for what's right and wrong. That's not what it is. Like, that's not what was ever established to do. But because people are cycling, looking for anything that they can hold on to, again, anything solid in a storm, in an earthquake, then they're going to an ad hoc moral organization. Please tell us what is right and wrong as you go, without a structured leadership. And then people get mad about the inconsistencies of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's like, what choice did they have? What choice did they have? There was no, it wasn't established to do that in the first place. So this is what's happening. When you have an impossible, constantly changing moral code that doesn't allow for forgiveness or restoration or healing, then people begin to implode. And then what do you need? You need to rebuild your self-esteem. Consult the list. You need a modicum of peace in a world that you're clearly not good enough for. You need a therapeutic worldview. And that's what happens next. So hedonism ignites the chaos. Moralism inflicts the pain, trying to solve the chaos. And then the therapeutic worldview is supposed to ease the pain. But it's not a coherent approach either. As much, and again, none of these terms are adequate, so don't hear me saying I'm so strongly in support of therapy. A lot more people should get it than do. So don't hear me saying something that I'm not. Okay, I'm talking specifically about this worldview as a story of everything. Okay, because when the goal is to experience peace at all times, you have to take away a bunch of the necessary tools for finding peace. Just think about it. You're Christians. When the whole thing is feel peace and cut out anything negative at all, what that means is there's no space for the prophetic. There's no space for conviction, for correction, for challenge. There's no space for the power of pain and suffering or refining fire. The things that ultimately find us rebuilt from the ashes we find ourselves in. None of those are on the table. if it's a therapeutic worldview where it's peace at all costs and this is the ultimate good. Does this make sense? It's self-defeating. And it's usually just an elaborate form of denial. One example of this that I think highlighted just the insufficiency of the worldview is some voices from the sort of therapeutic worldview and this mindset was giving advice on social media, of course, but giving advice to people who were bothered and unsettled and lacking peace because of the conflict in the Ukraine. And the advice that was given was, hey, if you're feeling anxiety about this, then we would encourage you, take some time for self-care, set aside, turn off the news, emotionally distance yourself from what's happening in the Ukraine. Decent advice. What do the Ukrainians think when they read that? There's a whole bunch of them who are just, screw you. Sorry that our tragedy is affecting your mood, right? And it's like, oh, wait a minute, it implodes upon itself, okay? So anyway, then nihilism emerges as a splash of cold water and a harsh reality check, right? But nihilism is the prophetic without any hope. All right? So before you have hope but without any prophetic leading, now you have the prophetic without any hope. Nihilism is honest about pain. It sees the hypocrisy of the therapeutic and the moralistic worldviews, but offers no relief. Martin Heidegger is a nihilistic philosopher, he was. And he had this concept of thrownness. And the idea is that all humans were just flung indiscriminately into the place that you find yourself. It's all entirely random. Thrownness, this is your reality. And what that means is there's no hope for an anchor. There's no hope for hope. And so nihilism says people are awful, and you're awful, and it's hopeless, and it's irreparable. So what's left now? Either suicide, a real mark among hedonists, or among nihilists, by the way, or what's the other option? Hedonism. Back around we go. Hedonism. It's like, well, if we're all screwed anyway, let's at least have some fun. Eat, drink, and be merry, and back around we go, the whole thing. You guys seen it? So, in summary, everybody's losing their heads. What would Paul say? Not you. Not you, not you, not you. Keep your head in all situations, not you. And when all of this nonsense is going on, if you are stable, if you are reasonable, if you are kind, if you are loving, it will be a stream in the desert for people who are lost. Before I did some sociology and some anthropology and some history, even though I'm not a sociologist, an anthropologist, or a historian, now let's do some physics. I have one Bible degree. I have no why in the world. Centrifugal force. Centrifugal force. You're familiar with this, even if not connected to the word. The faster things are spinning, the further those things are slung outward. So just like the swings at a carnival, when the swings start spinning, you don't expect the swings to stay straight down. They come out, okay? Because centrifugal force is pushing them outward. Anybody ever been to the Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama, by any chance? There you go. I went there when I was in the 5th grade, and they had a thing called the centrifuge, and what it did was spin you around really fast. And you get to like 3 Gs or 4 Gs or something like that, where you would feel 3 or 4 times as heavy because as it's spinning you and you're on the outside, it's creating all this outward pressure. And they said, be careful, people get sick. And I was like, not me, I'm going to be fine. So I was an idiot. And so while doing it, just to make my friends laugh, I was like swinging my head around. And I was like, see, this is fine. And then, of course, you know how the story ends. All over the place. Just everywhere. Fortunately, after we were off the machine, which helped. Yes, it's much better that way. Because then, let's not. You know what would happen. My son's learning how to throw a discus. You see somebody throw a discus? The faster he can spin, the further he can throw it. Because the faster things spin, the more centrifugal force you get. When society is churning the way that it is now, the faster it spins, the more far-fetched the theories become. And I think we're seeing that now. Polarization is becoming more and more extreme because the swirl just keeps slinging people into more and more far-fetched ideologies. And what scares me is that churches and church folks are getting caught up in the centrifugal force. Again, if we would just, by contrast, be anchored and steady and reasonable, if we would just keep our heads, we would stand out in the very best ways. The very best ways. The opposite of centrifugal force is centripetal force. Centripetal force is when the swirl doesn't sling you outward, but instead it pulls you to the center. So, an example of that, when I was, it was really early on when we planted the church, and Sharon and I, we moved into a new place, and we invited some people from the church to come help us paint the house. We had a paint party. And like so many people came. There's like 25 people there. We painted the house in like a few hours. It was so awesome. And then afterwards, this house had an above ground pool, a round one. And so the paint party finished early, so it became a pool party, and we all just jumped in. And I don't know how it started, but a group of people started together walking in the same direction around the perimeter of the pool. And they started going, and more people started, and then they started running around the perimeter of the pool in the water, and it created a whirlpool, like a legit whirlpool. It got really powerful. And what's amazing is, if you weren't like a really strong swimmer, you ended up in the middle. Like there was like all these kids with floaties, you know, because that's the age, and they were just all in the middle doing this, and they were so happy. Because the swirl was so intense. Sharon is too mature for this stuff, so she wasn't in, but I was, and she wanted to ask me a question, and I literally couldn't hold on to the side of the pool long enough for her to ask me a question because the swirl was pulling me around. The next morning when I got up, it was still spinning after it went all night long, okay? And it got spinning so much that you could see the surface of the water changing. It was lower in the middle. It started spilling out on the sides. And it created, again, all this centripetal force that drew everything to the center. So all the kids and the not strong swimmers and all the toys, it all got anchored in the very, very middle. While the society around us is succumbing to centrifugal force, I think it's vitally important that the people of God embrace the power of centripetal force. And rather than being flung further and further outward and getting caught up into the centrifugal mess that is making people more and more extreme and more hyperpolarized and more reactive and more afraid, if we will instead anchor in what is central, anchor in our core, we'll stand out again in all the best ways. There's a theologian's name's Jürgen Moltmann. I think that's how you say it. Moltmann, really heady guy. Don't read his stuff unless you're a total nerd. But he talks about, he coined this phrase, pusillanimous faith, which is, I know, a heck of a word. It's from his book, Crucified God, which is his best book. And basically says pusillanimous faith is a fear-based faith. And the fear is this. The fear is that our faith, Christian faith, cannot endure the challenges of a pluralistic society. And as a result, we have to eliminate the competitors. Moltmann was writing in reaction to, he's German, in reaction to Nazism and the nationalism that ultimately became Nazism. It started as a form of German Christian nationalism, okay? No histrionics there. We have a totally different set of circumstances. There's some overlap, but not a ton. I'm not saying we're, although there are new Nazis now. I don't want that, but that ultimate fear that says Christianity isn't strong enough to stand up against the pressures of pluralism is this fear-based reality that makes then Christians turn and attack the very same people they're supposed to be loving. And it is at the core of the sort of Christian combativeness that is really at the core of Christian nationalism. I don't think Jesus is strong enough to overcome this, so I'm going to abandon the way of Jesus in defense of Jesus. In order to defend Jesus, I'm going to wrestle against flesh and blood. I'm going to attack my enemies because Jesus is Lord, and it's entirely irrational. Jesus didn't tell us to protect him. He told us to follow him. I think it was Spurgeon who said the Bible's like a tiger. If you let it out of its cage, it'll protect itself. He doesn't need to be protected. Pusillanimous faith, by contrast, though, is a weak faith that is not about hope in Jesus. It's about self-preservation. And this is why Christian nationalism is so strongly marked by nominalism or faith that's way off on the fringe. It's interesting, if you survey the U.S., you'll find that about 7% of Americans are evangelicals. But if you tweak the questions just a little bit, you'll find out that 70% of Americans are evangelicals. That's a big difference. If you tweak the questions to say, do you generally have a sense that Christ is king? Do you generally, whatever the language is, do you ascribe to, are you more likely to go to a church than to, a fill-in-the-blank other house of worship? Then 70% will say yes, and we'll call them an evangelical. If we start to put a little finer point on that and instead say, do you have an ongoing relationship with Jesus? Are you connected into the life of a church? Are you, in the most basic way, biblically literate? Then that drops all the way to 7%. From 7% to 70%, okay? So what that means is nominalism is out the roof. People who have a sense of Jesus, a sense that we're vaguely Christian, and a sense that that's kind of the good stuff, all right? Like a general positive warmth toward Christians and faith. That's the mass of people in our country. And they're the ones who are becoming Christian nationalists. Because they're the ones who do not understand when someone says, hey, we're going to defend Jesus. We're going to stand up for the way of Jesus. We're going to fight for the cause of Jesus. And here we're going to do A, B, C, and D. And A, B, they have nothing to do with the way of Jesus. They don't know better. And instead they go, well, I love, that sounds like people are all on board. That seems like the right thing to do. That's what makes me so sad about the Christian nationalism stuff. People deeply believe that they're responding with centripetal force. What they're being told is things are spinning out of control, so we need to anchor into our core, to who we are. That's the messaging around Christian nationalism. But in reality, what's actually happening is they're reacting to centrifugal force. They're becoming combative. They're becoming deeply detached from the way of Jesus, and they're getting flung into further and further extremes. But they think they're getting anchored like never before. Does that make sense? So, a more, according to Maltman, and I agree, there is a more hopeful and robust faith that accepts the challenges of pluralism and different ideologies and different ways of thinking. And it maintains this hopeful expectation that the true and the good and the beautiful message of Jesus will prevail and it will emerge. Because at its very core, the message is true and good and beautiful. And rather than resorting to extremes, we need to anchor in our real core and see the forest for the trees. Society is panicking, trying to grab hold of something stable in the middle of an earthquake. They're desperate for something they can cast their anxieties onto. And rather than being the anchor, being the ones who keep their heads in the storms, I see more and more Christians joining the fray and losing their heads. And I see churches and leaders, it's interesting, bending and capitulating to accommodate these ever wilder, nonsensical, far-fetched, self-defeating worldviews that we talked about before. So I'll say it again. Christianity alone provides a logical, coherent story of everything. We need centripetal force to draw us to our core, our center. What I'm seeing is the opposite. And what's sad about it is increasingly, as churches are embracing more far-fetched ideas, they're saying we're doing it because we want to be relevant, we want to be culturally aware, we want to be loving. And at the very core of all of it, it's none of those things. It's fear. It's all fear. If you want to help people in a storm, don't sling yourself into the mess. Be the one thing that isn't moving. While everything else swirls out of control, be the rock. We need centripetal force moving us to our core, our foundation. I'm not saying don't be innovative. I'm not saying don't be relevant. I'm not saying don't be progressive in many senses of the word. What I'm saying is, now is the absolute worst time to depart from historic Christian orthodoxy. It's the worst time. It is not time for new far-fetched ideologies for itching ears. It's time for what our boy John Wimber would say, the main and the plain. The core of our faith, Jesus is Lord. The Word of God is true. Walk with Him. Surrender in full allegiance to Him. Love your neighbor. And for crying out loud, keep your heads. All right, one more verse here, actually, too. 1 Corinthians 16, 13, and 14. I love the way Paul ends this letter. Be alert, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong, do everything in love. A lot of people are just stopping at the end of verse 13. Let's be courageous, let's be strong, and forgetting that courage is ultimately defined by expressions of love. See, a lot of people are going to dig in their heels and say, we're not going to capitulate to culture. We're not going to let culture define our morality for us. Instead, we're going to be brave. To that, I would agree entirely. But if you're going to insist that culture cannot define morality for you, then you also need to insist that culture can't define courage for you. And culture is increasingly saying courage is being loud, it is being angry, it is stomping and screaming, it is red-faced and spitting. And the way of Jesus makes it very clear. It is love of neighbor, it is blessing those who persecute. It's last of all, it's servant of all. That's what courage looks like. So while nationalists and other sort of fringe groups are stomping and screaming, again, if we just go back to our core, be alert, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong, and do everything in love. Okay, so I kind of want to do a couple of things here. We got a couple of minutes. Are we okay? Did you see how I looked at her and asked if it was okay, and then didn't wait for an answer and just went on? It's like I'm gonna do it anyway. We are okay on time. So I just want to a couple of things. Can I ask you guys to stand? I think that might help. Would you do that, please? As you're able. If that's not comfortable for you, it's obviously fine. Let me just start by saying this. For sure, there have been times I've been caught in the swirl. And all along, I mean, for years now, I've been like, I'm not that guy. I'm not going to get caught in the swirl. I see what's going on. I'm not, and yet I do. I do. I get, like I said earlier, I get angry, and then I get angry at the people who are angry. Or I think, I'm not going to get caught up in this extremism, and then I go, oh, wait, there's this pull. There's a million different factors that are pulling you. There's lots of centrifugal force trying to sling you further and further extremes. So here's what I would want to submit to you. As aware and savvy about all these things as you may be, as faithful and intentional in teaching reasonableness and love as your pastors undoubtedly are, you're just not exempt from it. I don't believe that any of us remain unaffected. Because, as we said in the first session, in some ways the cracks are beginning to show. And the institutions aren't as trustworthy as perhaps they once were. And even if we're wrong about that, if we don't trust in those institutions as much, we're still afraid. And anxiety leaves us swirling and just vulnerable to pick up different ideologies. We had the list earlier of the 5 or so different worldviews. Not only have I had glimpses of these along the way, there have been times when I have all of those to some degree in me at once. A moralistic tendency, a hedonistic tendency, a therapeutic tendency, a nihilistic, all at once. Okay, so I don't think any of us are exempt. And so what I'd like to do is just take a minute to allow the Holy Spirit to highlight any way in which fear has gotten hold. And I think the Holy Spirit would love to invite you, okay, maybe you're not as trusting of the institutions as you once were. Maybe you had a lot of confidence in the political process and you no longer do. And so that's going to create anxiety. What are you doing with that anxiety? Are you casting it onto the Lord? Or are you taking it out on your political opponent, most likely? Okay? In some degree. Probably in this room, there's not wild swings, but maybe there's nuance. And so would you just begin to ask yourself, is there a way in which fear has started to shift your perspective? And then another thing, I had to get through this myself. The things that have shifted, the collapse of Christendom, et cetera, if you haven't taken the time to grieve that reality, it's going to leak. It's sad that Christianity is in decline in the United States. It's scary that it's in decline in the United States. It's scary. You can say, I understand now rationally why it's okay that Christendom collapsed, and how quite possibly that was the work of the Lord and it leads to good things. Great, hold on to that hope. It doesn't change the fact that it's sad that people you know and love have deconstructed and walked away from Jesus. That at one point you had people you could have perfectly kind and rational conversations, and that's no longer available to you anymore. And this is the one thing I felt the strongest when kind of praying for this leading up to it, is that there are people who are aware of that reality, but they haven't grieved that reality, and it's going to leak out into your relationships if you haven't held some space to grieve the loss. We've all lost some stuff. We've all lost relationships, people we love and care about. We are all seeing tensions in our own families that weren't there before. And so the third thing I want to do, and this is where I think hopefully we'll be able to maybe do some more traditional vineyard-style ministry time, where we lay hands on one another and invite the Holy Spirit to come and do some healing. So on an individual basis, would you allow the Holy Spirit to begin to speak to you about fear? On an individual basis, would you allow the Holy Spirit to show you if you need to create some space for grief, for what you have lost? And then corporately, here's what I would love to do. If there are people in the room who are, frankly, heartbroken because of the tension that's built up around you at work, relationships in your family that have been lost, whatever the case may be, and you're actively grieving that loss or the fact that that tension is there, I think it'd be really great for the people of God to gather around you and pray for you. Pray that you would be compelled by centripetal force to be anchored all the more in love and not spinning out of control and lobbing hurtful words and bombs along the way. And so I feel like we can do that as a community. So that's sort of the outline. Let's maybe take a moment to pray, assume the vineyard pose. Do you guys have that? We have that, if you want to. So Holy Spirit, come. We are in a fundamentally different reality because of our faith. When people lose the foundation upon which they can cast their anxiety, we still have you upon whom we can cast our anxiety. But we're also these busted people in a busted world, and we're just not exempt from the fear. It would be silly to think that the world around us is absolutely swimming in anxiety and we might somehow be exempt. And so, Lord, would you now begin to minister to people whose fear has perhaps stolen something from them, like stolen pieces of their personality, robbed their conversations of joy and light and hope because they're afraid. And it's not irrational to be afraid. It's not faithless to be afraid. It's a scary time. And yet you've not given us a spirit of fear, but power and love and a sound mind. And if we have to any degree begun to lose our heads, to any degree, if we find ourselves watching more news than we should, doom scrolling on social media longer than we ever should, we find ourselves, without even realizing, looking for the next hit of dopamine because of the anger that it creates and the position that it further entrenches. We're just not exempt from it. So, Lord, if there's strongholds connected to that, would you break them? If there are addictions connected to that, would you break them? Would you deliver from fear right now in Jesus' name? Regardless of what happens in this world, regardless of how profoundly things seem to our eyes to be swirling out of control, the fact is you are King. Your love endures forever. Your faithfulness never falters. You are good. You are renewing all things. And we are your people. We anchor us in these truths. Holy Spirit, would you now tap some people on the shoulder and say, you've got more grieving to do. You've experienced real loss. And the Lord would have you grieve fully with him and with community and people who love you over the course of however long that might take. But the Lord would have you grieve that in full so that then you don't move out into the world with that grief coloring in a bad way how you look to serve and love your neighbor. It leaks. It just does. We don't plan on it. We didn't decide for it. It just leaks. We respond in disproportionate ways to someone who holds this position or that, or has this political vantage point or that, or disagrees with us on this thing, and the appropriate response would be a 1, and we give them about a 9, because we're in that moment shifting blame for the grief that we haven't really expressed onto that person. And we're not to make victims of people. We are to serve the victims and restore them and see that justice is done on their behalf. Far be it from us as the people of God to be the oppressors. Instead, to be those who uplift. So, Lord, if you begin that work now, or if you initiate it for a time to be continued, Lord, would you show us if we need space for grief?